All right, welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today is the 16th episode. Today I'm here with the admin for Aristotelian memes, but even though he is a comedian on Facebook and he deals with philosophical issues in real life, he is also a great person and also has many interesting insights on different issues. So, Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm doing well. So, we talked a little bit before the interview started just about the work that we're doing. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing at university and so forth?
Yep, so currently I'm beginning the first year of a 2-year research program called the Master of Research at Macquarie University right now. And I'm trying to figure out where my interests lie in terms of doing further research. I'm thinking about doing it in the area of gender studies, specifically analyzing, and I've yet to determine which lens I'm going to analyze it, but analyzing what toxic and hegemonic masculinity really mean from a traditional point of view. That is to say, right now, at least, I want to analyze it from an Aristotelian point of view, specifically from an Aristotelian metaphysics and philosophy of nature, and from the virtue ethics, I guess, theories that are derivative from Aristotle's works.
What's really fascinating about that is that I'm also interested in that line of reasoning, that line of study. I think I've written a little bit about the issue of masculinity, so maybe on another show we could talk about our findings in that area. So I guess we can start off by asking, well, what really inspired you to start Aristotelian memes, the page through which we met, right? And if anybody isn't familiar, Aristotelian memes is a Facebook page that basically condenses the work of Aristotle into really, I think, dank and beautiful memes. So, Jeremy, tell me how you came to create that page.
So I was a fan of Socrates memes. I was a fan of pleasurable platonic memes and a few other ones. And I kept trying to find an Aristotle meme page or an Aristotelian meme page, and none existed. And I was shocked. I was like, how in the world is what some consider to be the second father of Western thought? How is his, I guess, namesake not used in this format? And being an Aristotelian myself, I'm a big fan of his work. I decided, well, I can't find the content for myself. I'm going to make it. I'm going to create it and see where it leads. And it's actually been a really, really good creative outlet, to say the least, especially since I'm on summer break right now. I began it in, I believe, November 29 is when I began it. And it's just been a very useful way to, one, I guess, take ideas that I have on a very regular basis and condense them down to a very easily accessible, and I try and make it anyway, funny format, just to get it out there, because I know that it couldn't just be me that thinks these things. It has to be other people who resonate with this stuff. And I tend to find that philosophy, at least in the academic world, tends to be extraordinarily dry. And I don't understand why that's the case. I mean, I guess that the nature of the subject matter makes it that way, but I think that what we study literally is the best things written down by mankind. So these need to be disseminated in a way that everyone can understand, because everyone deserves to learn about these things. It is literally cut to the core of what it means to be a human being, to understand what these concepts are. So that's partly why I made that page, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful purpose for making that page. And when I made Intellectual Conservatism, one of the things that I was worried about was I was looking around at different conservative pages, and there wasn't much, let's say, strong intellectual content. A lot of it was just memes or kind of like slogans, and I was worried. There are a few good ones here and there, but I wanted to contribute in my own way towards really making conservative ideas accessible. So then I guess both of us begin from the tradition of Aristotle. Both of us, I think, identify as natural law theorists and conservatives. So let's just first get to the question about the relevance of Aristotle. And let's begin with the relevance of Aristotle to your life. So how has Aristotle affected your ethical framework, how you approach the world and view it?
Yeah. So first and foremost, and I wrote a paper on this in my third year of my undergraduate, so my final year of my bachelor's degree, on why virtue ethics, specifically tied to a natural law metaphysical framework, why that is the best way to have an action guiding system in place. And basically, the reason that I like it so much is that it's not strictly on the utilitarian side of things, where it's all about what the consequences of what we do are, and it's not very Kantian either, in that, duties and the primacy of reason alone and the will alone. What it does is it, from the most deepest parts of the theoretical side, maps very, very well onto the everyday practicalities of what it means to be human. And that just is what the golden mean when it comes to virtues is, right? So whenever I do any given action, I say, okay, people tend to say that action X, stealing, is wrong. Why is stealing wrong? Well, because it is the inappropriate way to acquire goods, right? And how do we make intelligible what it means to then be the appropriate way to acquire goods? Well, we have to then go a step further and say, okay, what grounds rights in the first instance, and what grounds rights, at least for me and for, I think, most natural law theorists, is that the distinctive ends that we have as human beings are what grounds our rights. So my right to life only exists if I have a life, and if the perpetuation of my existence as a living organism is not just here and now relevant, but it's also relevant for the future. So in a way, it's a consequentialist kind of theory, right? It's forward-looking, purpose driven, but it also encapsulates very nicely, I think, Kant's conception of duties, as in that which we ought to do based on the very nature of the actions themselves. So, for example, my duty to promote other people's lives comes precisely from the fact that they are living organisms. So this means that their right to life becomes my duty to not impose on their lives, right? So that's, I guess, a very, very broad sketch on the way that natural law theory and the Aristotelian ethics tend to tie together in my everyday life and also in my theoretical life as well.
Yeah, and going off of that point, many natural law theorists discuss kind of the perverted faculty argument. So since our bodies have different means towards, or ends to which we are directed, kind of there's that telos, that teleology, of which my body is composed towards a certain end. Many natural law theorists say, for example, well, when we discuss, for example, sexual ethics, right? My organs have a certain end to which they are ordered towards, and if I somehow prevent or pervert that faculty from performing its proper function, then in some way or another, I'm violating kind of that telos. But in recent years, I've seen kind of people question that line of reasoning, the perverted faculty argument. For example, one example is that, well, when people go shooting on a shooting range, they stick in earmuffs, and earmuffs prevent the ear's proper function to hear, right? Does that stand as a criticism or defeater of natural law theory?
I would say so. That's a very simplistic and caricatured way of understanding what it means for a thing to have a purpose. And I'll go with the example of food, right? So I'm a personal trainer, dietary and lifestyle coach, besides being a philosophy student. So I deal with people's, I guess, dietary habits and exercise habits on a very frequent basis. And the thing to note about the reason that we have desires to eat in the first place, hunger and thirst for water and stuff like that, is precisely to keep us alive. And when we pervert the faculty of hunger and of thirst, and in total of digestion and so on and so forth, by eating excessively fatty, excessively sugary foods, what happens? We end up becoming obese, precisely because we are not using that faculty in the way that nature fitted us out for it to be used. And going to the point about plugging in the earplugs to prevent your ears from getting damaged, that's precisely why that's a bad argument to say against the perverted faculty argument, because no, what I'm doing is I'm momentarily preserving the integrity of my eardrum while pursuing at least what you would hope to be an even more worthwhile goal in that moment. To practice shooting is one part. It's for the fun of it. Also, it is to practice self-defense. If I don't practice my ability to defend myself, then the purpose of having ears in the first place for me to survive and to thrive becomes nullified anyway. So there's a hierarchy when it comes to when we understand the faculties that we have. So if, for example, my arm becomes infected and needs to be cut off, well, we can say on a perverted faculty argument, that doesn't work unless you actually have to cut off the arm to preserve the organism itself. So if I just want to cut off my arm because I identify as someone who only has one arm, which is, from my understanding, what the trans-able people tend to say, is that, I identify as someone with a disability. I identify without a leg or without an arm. We know that the precise reason why we say that that's a mental issue or a mental illness is because we know what the function of having an arm is. But we would not say the same thing about someone who says, I want my arm cut off because I'm going to get infected throughout my entire body and then I'm going to die. And we all, I think, intuitively know that. I would word it this way: the natural law fits us out with the ability to intuitively grasp the difference between me cutting my arm off just because I want to, or because there's some mental illness causing me to do that, or because I'm doing it to preserve my overall body.
Yeah, definitely. In recent years, I've also seen people entertain the idea of moral relativism more and more. And, this is kind of going a little bit off script, but what I'm interested in is kind of, how would you go about talking to somebody who is a moral relativist? I mean, you've already presented the natural law framework, but are there maybe ideas within moral relativism itself that shows it to be kind of maybe inconsistent by its own standards?
Yeah, it depends on what kind of moral relativism we are talking about. I mean, I would say that if we're going, I guess, with a socio-cultural relativism, where we say that, well, the way that the Aztecs or the Incas, the people who used to perform human sacrifice, right?
Is either one of them, yeah.
Whoever it is, community 1,000 years ago, whatever have you, who used to perform human sacrifice, and then the royalty would eat the hearts of these willing victims. We can say that no, relativism doesn't work there, because if a thing is wrong, that is to say, if today it is wrong to cut out human hearts, and we know this because we each have the right to life based on the natural law, I guess, framework that I mentioned slightly earlier, then we go one step further and say, given that an individual person has a right to life, and what is common amongst all human beings is life, therefore the right to not have my heart cut out and eaten by someone else is a universal thing, meaning it transcends societies, cultures, temporal locations throughout history. So I think that when it comes to certain principles, the universality of them is built into the very premises that we are talking about. So the very fact that we all live entails that any living human throughout history, in virtue of being living, has that right. So that is, we can't say, oh well, today, let's say in 1,000 years' time, right? We begin to then develop the practice again of human sacrifice and say, well, look, that's in the future, right? That's not us right now. For them, relative to their culture, relative to the utility that comes about through eating human hearts, that is morally correct for them. It's one, to me, it's an incoherent conception of what morality and ethics actually are. And at least for myself, when I think of morality and ethics, I think of the well-being and flourishing of human beings. And that makes intelligible what, when we say a thing is good or bad, morally speaking, that's why the utility maximizing of the utilitarian is how it is because it's trying to maximize the number of good units, if you will, within the world. But then there is also, I guess, a smaller kind of small r relativism, where we say, well, I can only know what is right for me given my particular context. My individuated being in the world is going to be relative to other people. So in that way, sure, it is a relative thing in that what is right for you right now may not be right for me. It's relative to your life circumstances, whether you should continue studying philosophy or study to become a doctor or whatever have you. But that's a different argument altogether, I think.
Yeah, and it seems as if the second little r is more descriptive than it is normative, if that makes sense. So,
yeah,
discussing this from the perspective, I think, we are both theists, except we come from different traditions, but nonetheless, we're both natural law theorists. I've heard some atheists try to argue that, well, look, there are two different arguments that I've seen. So more of the atheist humanists, they raise the argument that morality is just a brute fact of human beings. It requires no further explanation, right? And then the second response I hear from atheists is that, there is a telos, but it's given to us by evolution, and natural law does not point to God. So the two propositions then are, is morality just a brute fact of the universe? And then second, does the natural law actually point us to a higher reality?
Those are very tough and very good questions. By brute fact, you mean that, I guess, moral facts just exist in and of themselves without any intelligible reason for them existing?
Yeah, in that sense. So, for example, some people use the example of pain, right? So you don't need a further explanation for why pain is bad. When you feel pain, you just know it's bad, right? So I don't need some further philosophizing on that issue. And then if we take, for example, other moral atrocities, it's like, well, we don't need a further explanation. We see it and we know it to be such.
Yeah, so the problem that I have with that is that it can't stop there. That's how moral theorizing starts. It starts with going back to the intuitions that I was talking about, right? The intuition, it seems to me to be that excessive pain and suffering, genocide, is wrong. Good. That's a good framework from which to live your day-to-day life on a phenomenological point of view, because if you don't have that intuition, then there's something seriously wrong with you, obviously. But I think that for the intellectually curious person, we want to know not only is it wrong, but what ultimately grounds that wrongness. Where do we point to say, like, do I pull out a calculator and say, it's wrong because there are this many units of discomfort? Do I look to nature and say, well, look, nature itself is replete with seemingly unnecessary suffering? When you watch the way that lions and other predators tend to literally eviscerate their prey, it's like, well, we are also animals. Why go the way and say that pain is wrong? So the intuition on a naturalistic framework, again, works as a starting point of moral reason, if you will. It's one of the first principles of moral reason, is to know that that is wrong because it seems to me to be wrong. But it seems to me that ultimately we need to ground that in something more substantial than just, it seems to me to be this way. And this is part of the reason why I critique some Enlightenment principles, because they, in doing away with God as being itself, the metaphysically ultimate existence, they're also doing away with everything else that follows from that, including the intrinsic value that human beings have. Because if we are nothing but a collection of atoms or subparticles in a particular configuration that looks like a human, acts like a human, and so on and so forth, well, we can only make descriptive claims. The famous is-ought gap becomes infinitely massive if we don't have a way to bridge the pain is bad, we ought to go towards a different state of the world. And when it comes to, at least for, again, speaking for myself and my understanding, going back to the right to life for a second, what the right to life is really is a right to at least have the freedom to maximize my own being, to fully actualize the potentialities that I have. And we know that, you know, when we look at someone who's giving a lot of money to charity, or who's a very good host at a party or whatever have you, you know, that is better than someone who robs, rapes, murders, whatever have you, because the person is further actualizing their inherent being, their inherent nature. But since we are trying to actualize our inherent being, our inherent nature, and the ultimately existing thing is God, then pain itself becomes contextualized as the mechanism by which we orient ourselves towards existence. And since God is the ultimate existent thing, ultimately, when we really boil down all the arguments, even a singular instance of pain, at least to me, seems to be there to point us towards God.
Yeah, that's
so God is both the first principle of normative moral claims and the last as well.
All right. So before we continue to the next section, I want to ask you one last question, which is that right now we've discussed kind of ethics and meta-ethics, but I'm also interested in how Aristotle applied this philosophy to politics. So you can take this question two ways. You could take it as, you know, your chance to kind of explain what Aristotle's politics were, or you can kind of go more into how it has influenced your politics. I'll leave that open for you to decide.
Look, I'll answer as best as I can from what I know about Aristotle, and I'll also, I guess, explore a bit how it influences my conception of what, I guess, the individual's relationship to the political community. So for the ancients, and in particular for Aristotle, from my understanding, the political system, or the nature of ethics itself, and I believe he writes this at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, he says that the next order of study is politics, because politics just is man in the aggregate, or human beings as a massive collective, as opposed to human beings on the day-to-day individual dealings. So politics is just a natural extension on ethics. That's the first thing I would say. Second thing is, for Aristotle, in converse to someone like a Hobbes or a social contractarian, the polis, the political community, is more like a natural organism than like a machine. Whereas for a machine, take a clock for example, each of the cogs in the clock work together to make the clock function, but there's nothing intrinsic about one cog in and of itself that means that it's for the purpose of the functioning of the clock in and of itself. We have to impose that onto it, right? Like clocks don't occur by nature. Whereas if you take a living organism, the brain, the heart, the lungs, they're all built in for the purpose of the flourishing of the entire organism itself. So there's a deep intrinsic connection between the organism and the organs, as opposed to the clock and its parts. And so I think for an Aristotelian, it's more along the lines of the way that the organism relates to its organs. In this case, let's say each individual cell is an individual person, and then we come together to form communities, you know, bigger communities, and so on and so forth. And this sets in the mind of someone like myself a very deep connection between myself and my country and my community, just my immediate community as well, where I believe it was JFK who said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Not thinking about the country or the political community as some parent who's meant to baby you, but as it were, we are the parents for our nation. We are the ones who are meant to be fitting ourselves into in a way that we can give back and properly ensure the functioning of the whole by us as an individual and as a family unit and so on and so forth flourishing. Whereas if we try and just ourselves flourish, which I guess is getting more into the radical libertarian side of things, at the expense of other people or indifferent to other people, then we are missing a very, very deep thing, because as Aristotle noted, we are not only rational, we are also naturally social beings. And one of the things that I've noticed when it comes to the findings in neuroscience is that people get amazed, right? Or they go, wow, when human beings socialize, this area of the brain lights up and it means that they are having fun. It is a good thing to socialize. Now that's a surprise to someone with a mechanistic framework on the way that human beings deal with each other. But if we deal with it on a more teleological, like organism style way of thinking, as the ancients used to, then we would predict that dealing with other people and dealing with my community at large in a positive, constructive way is going to make me feel good.